It's kind of a soft argument, let's say, in the sense that I don't have right now to, go point by point and provide all the evidence necessary. So I wouldn't make that argument in a, let's say, in an academic setting yet. But I would throw the idea there to at least consider it.
How do political movements compare? So like we looked at a bunch of the uprisings in Latin America. How do they compare to, say, those in Canada in terms of form, size, what they do? What's sort of the difference?
It is hard to establish difference because, well, first of all, we see in Latin America every single movement is different from each other. Interestingly enough, though, I usually, in order to conceptualize the relationship between indigenous peoples, natives, with the state, because I work with indigenous peoples in the Southern Cone, meaning which are contexts in which indigenous peoples are 1.5, 2% of the population, I immediately go back to the North American case because the challenges are more similar than, let's say, with the Andes. So, for example, Argentina and Chile implemented the policies of reservations that were implemented in North America. So, I don't know, I think one of the major differences is that the natives in Canada perhaps have been able to find some of the advantages of a consolidated democracy. I'm using political scientist vocabulary now. Consolidation, transition, whatever it means, anyways. But the idea of a very long-lasting democracy, and I think when countries like Chile are implementing terrorist law because it's the only legal instrument that the Chilean government has to persecute in court political mobilization of the Mapuche by accusing them of terrorism. Yet, I touch wood, in the case of Canada, peoples in this case, the Mapuche, have been articulating the recuperaciones, right? The attempt to, give shape to the rights. I mean, the recognition is a first step, but without a territory, and I'm talking territory and not land, this has been the major shift. The peasants used to talk about land. It was sort of a class-based movement. Land was still conceived as a major commodity, right? That instead of being a commodity in the market, it would be a collective asset for the community, along socialist, communist lines. But the idea of territory is land plus the cultural understanding of that relationship between indigenous peoples and the land. And this is where the paradox becomes visible. The fact that, the Indio Permitido is the Indio that claims maybe a little, bilingual education, the Indian that claims, the right to have their own holidays, the Indian that claims, that people don't fire them because they're Indians. They can take people to court for discrimination law. But then again, the Indio no permitido is the Indian, the communities that decide, let's say, to recuperate parts of territory that, in the case of the Mapuche, was their grandfathers that were living there, and in the last, they saw the first parcel of land taken in the 70s under dictatorship, so they couldn't do much because, well, they're gonna kick the hell out of you, your ass. And then, the 80s happened, and a company came and took over these 40 hectares, and all of a sudden, their families are expanding. The cattle needs to have the pastures for the summer and the winter. In the case of the Cordillera, you need to move your cattle depending on the season, but you can't do it. So the pressure, basically, and now with political organization, they're able to recuperate, to make a recuperación. But it's only a matter of time where, where the state says, no, that's a criminal offense. And I spent part of my field work the last time I was in Argentina driving the Mapuche back and forth to the courts every day. Because I had the car, so instead of, I feel bad, they had to take the bus, so I did my interviews in the car while I was taking them to the judge. All right? And it's the criminalization of their demands.
Since like many neoliberal policies are advocated by supranational institutions like the IMF, how can indigenous movements interact with at this level, or are they forced to strictly act at a national level?
At the international level?
Can they operate at the international level, or are they forced to act at the national level?
Well, I think one of the recent tendencies, particularly in the Andes, is a transnationalization of indigenous things in general. I say things knowing that is the broadest thing I can say. And they're to the point that, as some the work by Andolin and Radcliffe and a bunch of people, they're showing how increasingly indigenous mobilization takes place within agencies of power and no longer at their gates. I think that's the metaphor they use. So in other words, what we had before is the struggle to get close to the gate. And in the case of Ecuador, of course, or in the case of Bolivia, they're not better examples than those two. The gates of power, the state. With the neoliberalization of the state, means that that state now is connected to those international institutions. So in development, for example, my area of focus, you will find this sort of new area of indigenous development along the lines, of course, of expanding markets and commodification of land and so on and so forth. So what you will find is Indians going from the local to the transnational. In other words, from Neuquén to Barcelona, Barcelona to New York, to talk about their issues, to negotiate their issues. These same authors talk about the reloaded boomerang, right? Because it's kind of, they throw their demands to the international institutions, demands for territory, for development, for microcredits, you name it. They just throw their demands out there. That's why they use the idea of the boomerang. It comes back in the form of a development project now for Indians. It's reloaded, however. So it's not just a boomerang, it's also a reloaded boomerang. And reloaded meaning that it comes back in a language that neoliberals can feel comfortable with. It goes as the Indian that may not be a permitido one, the Indian that may not be with rough edges, let's say, but it comes back as an Indio permitido framework. Okay, so the development is going to be, we're going to give you money to it, so you can all meet every week and decide what to do, and we're going to give you money to, start your own radio station, in the case of the Mapuche. Then, of course, we're not talking about passive, co-opted movements. I never use either of those ideas in my work. I disagree completely with the idea that they're just taking it. They reframe it. So, for example, they got through a World Bank, in the case of the Mapuche project, a lot of money for communities. With that money, they got a truck for the leaders to go to connect the communities, and they came out with a station, with an AM station, which for the first time allowed all the communities to be connected. Just imagine the impact that it will have to feel part of a saying, of a political identity. Before that, it was only done once a year through their ceremonial, in the case of the Mapuche I'm talking, through their ceremonial gatherings. They would get together and of course they would share the experiences. But just imagine if every day of your life you can wake up, as many of these, particularly the rural Mapuches, can wake up and their only contact is through this radio that has Mapuche content. Their own language, Mapungun, but also national, international news as they relate to Mapuche struggles. So you open and you're going to hear the bulletin about anti-globalization struggles across the world, and so on and so forth. So I think indigenous movements, I don't know if I'm answering precisely to your question, but I get the sense that indigenous movements are now able to transcend the boundaries of the state for their struggles. In fact, in some cases, it's not even that important anymore. And that's sort of another outcome of the neoliberalization of the state. Okay, you wanted the state to be ineffective, now it is. Just live with it. Yes?
Yeah. First of all, question, so you actually met Marcos?
I met Marcos. Well, when I said met Marcos, it's not like, hey, Marcos. Yes. He was like this close.
¿Was en la realidad? Or was it?
No, it was near Sonora.
Ah, in Sonora.
In Yaqui territory.
Wow. Alright, my question was asked, but I don't want to take too much of your time, either way, and everyone else's. But very broad. If you could kind of summarize, or not summarize, but the idea of the Latin, I just want to go back to this is the idea of the Latin American identity, and
that's a big.
it's been a really, really, really hard, very complex thing to talk about. When you talk about the nation state trying to like reincorporate itself or restructuring itself into this new pluricultural state that includes indigenous.